The rain over Néo-Paris wasn't water. It was a cocktail of diluted acids and industrial runoff, a persistent, sizzling mist that tasted of rust and regret. It clung to the rusted gantries of the old quarter, making every handhold a gamble. Lara Vance felt it seep into the collar of her synth leather jacket, a cold trickle against her neck. She ignored it. Cold was a luxury. High above the river of neon that flooded the boulevards below, she pressed herself flat against a groaning metal beam. The wind, funneled between the monstrous Haussmann-era buildings now scabbed with arcologies, tried to peel her from her perch. Her left hand, gloved and gritty, held fast. Her right, a marvel of scavenged dexterity, worked deftly on the access panel of a corporate comms relay. Her target was inside, a pre-collapsed neuroprocessor, ancient by today's standards, but priceless for its stability. Her world was a tale of two eyes. The right, her own, was a deep, worried brown. The left was a pale blue cybernetic orb, a black market find whose iris constantly flickered with diagnostic data. It saw the world in wireframes and thermal signatures, a constant stream of information that scrolled past her consciousness. Right now, it highlighted the processor's energy signature in a soft gold, pulsing like a trapped heart. A final twist of her multi-tool and the panel hissed open. There it was. Smaller than her thumb, nested in a bed of fiber-optic filaments. Her fingers, nimble and sure, went for it. The moment her skin touched the cool ceramic, an alarm blared, not a loud klaxon, but a high-frequency shriek that vibrated through the metal frame and into her bones. Time to go. She pocketed the processor, snapped the panel shut, and launched herself into the gap between buildings. For a terrifying second, she was airborne, a silhouette against the lurid glow of 100 holographic ads. Her boots hit the opposite rooftop with a muffled thud. She didn't break stride, melting into the shadows of ventilation units and forgotten rooftop gardens. The shriek faded behind her, swallowed by the city's endless hum. She was just another ghost in the machine. The descent into the Undercity was a journey through layers of history and decay. Lara navigated the vertical slums, a maze of makeshift walkways and repurposed service elevators, until she reached the humming warmth of the old metro tunnels. Here, below the toxic rain and the corporate sky spires, a different kind of life festered. The air smelled of damp earth, recycled air, and the synthetic onion soup sold at street-side stalls. Her home was a decommissioned maintenance alcove, sealed off with a scavenged blast door. Inside, the space was cramped but meticulously organized. Tools hung in neat rows, wires were bundled and secured, and a single hydroponic lamp cast a healthy green glow over a pot of real, soil-grown herbs. It was the only splash of living color in their world of chrome and concrete. Lara. The voice was thin, fragile as spun glass. Cora sat up on her cot, a patchwork quilt pulled up to her chin. Her face, so much like Lara's but softer, unburdened by cynicism, was pale. The chrome plate on her temple, a standard-issue data port from the public creches, flickered erratically. "I'm here," Lara said, her voice softening instantly. She shrugged off her wet jacket and knelt by the cot, forcing a smile. "Brought you something." She offered not the processor, but a small, bruised apple she traded for on the way down. A real apple. Cora's eyes lit up. "You shouldn't have." She took it with a reverence that broke Lara's heart. "Just a lucky find," Lara lied, tucking a stray strand of hair behind Cora's ear. Her fingers brushed the data port. It felt too warm. Her smile faltered. "How are you feeling?" "A little fuzzy," Cora admitted, her gaze drifting. "The words, sometimes they get stuck. Like a corrupted file." Before Lara could respond, Cora's body went rigid. A violent tremor shook her small frame, her jaw clenched, and her eyes rolled back. The light on her temple flashed a furious, panicked red. Chrome phage. A degenerative disease, a curse of the poor, where the body's own bioelectric field started rejecting its cybernetic implants, turning them from helpful tools into sources of cascading poison. Lara's training took over. She turned her sister gently onto her side, whispering soothing words that were more for herself than for Cora. She watched the seizure run its brutal course, her own heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic, helpless rhythm. Each tremor was a tick of a clock she couldn't see, a clock that was running out of time. When it was over, Cora lay limp and unconscious, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. Lara wiped it away, her hand shaking. The processor in her pocket felt heavy as a tombstone. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Dr. Lauren's clinic was hidden behind a noodle shop that vented steam smelling of ginger and despair. The man himself was as worn as his equipment, his face a roadmap of disillusionment. He ran a diagnostic wand over Cora's temple, his own cybernetic eye, an older, chunkier model than Lara's, whirring audibly. The results flickered onto a cracked monitor. "The cascade is accelerating," Laurent said, not bothering to soften the blow. He gestured at the screen, at the angry red lines that looked like lightning trapped in a diagram of Cora's nervous system. "The rejection is systemic now. Her data port is poisoning her neural pathways. It's a feedback loop. The more her body fights it, the more toxic the implant becomes. You can't just take it out." Lara's voice was tight. "And what? She was 6 when she got it in the creche. Her brain architecture grew around it. Removing it now would be like yanking the foundation from a skyscraper. She'd be a vegetable." He sighed, rubbing his tired, biological eye. "I can give her suppressants. Dampen the symptoms. But it's a patch, Lara. A small bit of tape over a ruptured dam. She has months. Maybe." The word hung in the sterile air. Months, an eternity, and no time at all. Desperation, cold and sharp, pierced through Lara's carefully constructed pragmatism. There has to be something else. Some other way. A total reboot, a foundational code, anything. Laurent leaned back, his chair groaning in protest. He looked at Lara, at the fire in her mismatched eyes. He'd seen that look before. It was the look of someone about to do something incredibly stupid. "There are stories," he began, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Madman's tales. They talk about the early days of biointegration, before the corporation sanitized it. Before the collapse. They say one of the architects, a genius, went rogue. Dr. Kalin." Lara's breath hitched. She'd heard the name. A boogeyman story junkers told each other around flickering fires. "They say he saw the phage coming," Laurent continued, warming to his tale. "Said it was an inevitable consequence of mass-produced, sloppy cybernetics. He fled when his corporate masters at Omnivi Solutions tried to weaponize his research. There was an accident. An explosion. They say he survived by using his own unstable prototype on himself. He lives, they say, in the one place no one would ever look for him." "Where?" Lara demanded. Laurent gestured vaguely upwards. Towards the surface, towards the sky she could not see. "The Tour Montparnasse. The great, black tombstone on the skyline. No one's been inside for 50 years, not since the static zones poisoned the district. They call him the Spectre de Montparnasse now. A ghost in a high-tech coffin." He shook his head. "It's a fool's errand, Lara. A fairy tale. The man is likely long dead. Or worse, alive." Lara's mind raced. A fool's errand. A fairy tale. But it was also the only thread she had. She looked at Cora, sleeping fitfully on the clinic's cot, her breathing shallow. Fairy tales were for children. But hope, she was learning, was a tool for the desperate. That night, Lara didn't sleep. She sat by Cora's side, watching the steady, fragile rhythm of her breath. The city hummed its electric lullaby outside, a sound that had once been comforting but now felt menacing. A countdown. Laurent's words echoed in her head. A fool's errand. She looked at her own hands. Grimy, calloused, but capable. She looked at her cyber-eye's reflection in a polished tool. A piece of tech that made her who she was, a part of her she never questioned. And now, a similar piece of tech was killing her sister. The irony was a bitter acid in her throat. The decision settled not like a thunderclap, but like a slow-leaking poison. It wasn't a choice, but an inevitability. There were no other paths. Every other door was a wall. As the first hints of the Undercity's simulated dawn, a gradual brightening of the overhead glow panels, filtered into their alcove, she began to move. She packed a small, durable bag. Extra energy cells. Water purification tablets. A protein bar. Her multi-tool. A small EMP charge. Just in case. She took the processor she had risked her life for and tucked it deep inside, a token of a plan that now seemed laughably small. She scribbled a note on a piece of flimsoplast, the words stark and insufficient. Asterisk Cora, I've gone to find a cure. A real one. Stay with Laurent. Be brave. I love you, asterisk she left it on the cot, next to the half-eaten apple. At the alcove's door, she paused, taking one last look at her sister. A small, fragile shape in the gloom. This was the center of her universe. And she was about to walk away from it, into the mouth of a fairy tale monster, on the whisper of a chance. Her hand rested on the cold metal of the door. The logical, pragmatic part of her brain, the part that had kept them alive for a decade, screamed at her to stop. It was suicide. But then she remembered the tremor in Cora's limbs. The corrupted file look in her eyes. Love, she realized, was the ultimate logical fallacy. It defied all data. And it was the only thing she had left. She opened the door and stepped out, not looking back. She walked through the waking tunnels, her face set, her gaze fixed on the exit ramps that led up into the toxic, rain-slicked world of the surface. And beyond it, piercing the perpetual gray clouds, she could just imagine the dark, monolithic silhouette of the Tour Montparnasse, waiting. A silent challenge. A tomb. Or a sanctuary. The static zones were a graveyard. The skeletons of automobiles lay half-submerged in rust-colored puddles. The facades of buildings were scarred and melted, twisted into shapes of agony by the chemical storms and data plagues of the collapse. The air was thick with a low, crackling hum that made Lara's teeth ache and the data stream in her cyber-eye flicker with corrupted code. This was a place where technology had come to die, and it had poisoned the very earth as it expired. She moved like a wraith, her filtration mask turning her breaths into rhythmic, Darth Vader-esque hisses. Her cyber-eye, shielded against the worst of the ambient energy, was her guide, painting paths of least resistance in faint green over the hazardous terrain. She dodged rogue security drones, their patrol patterns degraded into spastic, unpredictable twitches. She skirted pools of shimmering, rainbow-colored sludge that would eat through the sole of her boot in seconds. For 3 days, she journeyed through this purgatory. The loneliness was a physical weight, broken only by the skittering of mutated fauna and the groan of decaying structures. The monolithic tower of Montparnasse grew ever larger. A black needle aimed at the heart of the bruised sky. It seemed to absorb the light, its thousands of darkened windows like the vacant eyes of a skull. Breaching its perimeter was easier and harder than she expected. The high-tech defenses, laser grids, pressure plates, were long dead. The difficulty lay in the physical barriers. A collapsed metro line had created a deep chasm around its base. She spent half a day rigging a line to swing across. Her heart in her throat as she soared over the drop, the wind whistling a desolate tune. The main doors were sealed by a meter of solid steel. She found her way in through a shattered, ground-floor window, a black maw that gaped like a scream. The moment she crawled through, the outside world vanished. The humming of the static zones was replaced by a profound, tomb-like silence. The air inside was cold, sterile, and ancient. It smelled of ozone, dust, and something else, something metallic and faintly alive. She stood in a cavernous lobby. Marble floors were cracked, and dead ferns drooped from massive planters. A corporate logo, OmniVie Solutions, was still faintly visible on a far wall, a ghost of a forgotten era. It was a place of profound stillness, a moment frozen in time. But she was not alone. Her cyber eye detected it first. A flicker of movement on the upper mezzanine. Not a drone. The heat signature was too large, too organic. You should not be here. The voice was not a sound. It was an intrusion. It crackled directly inside her head, transmitted via some local, high-frequency broadcast that bypassed her ears entirely. It was a distorted, digital rasp, layered with static, like a recording played over a broken speaker. Lara froze, her hand dropping to the EMP charge on her belt. She scanned the shadows of the mezzanine. And then she saw him. He descended from the darkness, not on a staircase, but on a repurposed industrial lift that moved with unnerving silence. He was a nightmare of chrome and flesh. Taller than any man, a towering, asymmetrical frame of military and medical robotics. One arm was a multi-jointed claw, ending in surgical sharp talons. The other was more humanoid, but encased in polished metal. Wires, thick as snakes, snaked across his chassis, pulsing with a faint inner light. And the face, half of it was gaunt, scarred human skin, with a single, burning, intelligent eye. The other half was a complex lattice of sensors, lenses, and polished chrome. The Spectre de Montparnasse. He was real. "I am not here to steal," Lara said, her voice sounding small and thin in the vast lobby. She forced herself to stand her ground, to meet that single, searing human eye. The Spectre, Kalen, came to a halt 10 meters from her. The air crackled around him. "All who enter this place are thieves. They seek to steal knowledge, technology, or life. State your purpose, or be removed." The digital voice in her skull was flat, devoid of emotion, which only made it more menacing. "My sister," she began, the words catching in her throat. "She's dying. Chrome phage. Her implants are, it's a cascade failure." A sound, like grinding metal, might have been a laugh. A predictable outcome of corporate avarice and flawed design. A problem of the world outside. It has no place here. This is a sanctuary. A tomb. Not a clinic. They said you were the one who understood it. The one who saw it coming, Lara pressed, taking a half step forward. "I'm not asking for a handout. I'm a junker. A tech. I can work. I can pay. Pay." The voice was laced with a new texture, digital contempt. "With what? Scraps. Trinkets. Your fleeting biological existence. This place has no use for your currency. Leave. Now." He raised the clawed arm, its joints whirring as it powered up. Lara's survival instincts screamed at her to run. But the image of Cora, pale and shaking, was seared behind her eyes. "No." The word, quiet but firm, hung in the air. Kalen paused. That single human eye narrowed slightly. Defiance is illogical when facing superior force. "It's all I have left," Lara shot back, her fear transmuting into a raw, desperate anger. "You want me to leave? Then you'll have to throw me out. Or kill me. Because I am not going back out there with nothing." As she spoke, a low, guttural groan echoed from deep within the tower. A bank of lights flickered and died. A red emergency icon flashed on a nearby terminal, Air Filtration Unit 3, critical failure. Atmospheric contaminants rising. Kalen's head snapped toward the terminal. A string of code flashed in his optical sensors. A cascade of its own, he murmured, the voice in her head momentarily distracted. He turned back to her. His massive form seeming to fill the lobby. "Your presence is an unacceptable variable. This conversation is over." He started toward her, his heavy footfalls shaking the cracked marble floor. But Lara's eyes were locked on the terminal. Air filtration. She knew the schematics for this model. It was an old Omnivice system, notorious for its fragile energy converters. "Wait," she yelled. "The thermal regulator on the converter unit. It's failing, isn't it? The vibration is causing a feedback loop in the plasma conduits." Kalen stopped dead. His sensor-laden face tilted. "Your knowledge is unexpected. Your claw is too big to reach the bypass switch without frying the entire circuit board," Lara continued, her mind racing, finding footing in the one thing she understood. "But my hand isn't." She looked from the terminal to the towering monster before her. A new kind of bargain was forming in her mind, one not of money or pleas, but of pure utility. "Let me fix it. In exchange, you give me access to your medical archives. I'll find the cure myself. I won't bother you. I'll be a ghost in your own machine." For a long moment, the only sound was the dying groan of the filtration unit. Kalen stared at her, his human eye and his cluster of optical sensors processing this new, illogical data point. A small, desperate, defiant human. "The bargain is asymmetrical," his voice rasped in her skull. "But logical. Proceed. Show me your worth." He led her not with words, but with a silent turn, his massive form moving with an eerie grace through the labyrinthine corridors of the tower. They descended into the sublevels, into the guts of the machine. The air grew warmer, thick with the smell of hot metal and ozone. Here, the silence was replaced by the hum and click of active machinery, a mechanical heartbeat. The failing filtration unit was a behemoth of steel and copper wiring, taking up an entire room. A panel on its side was open, revealing a nightmarishly complex array of conduits and circuit boards. Just as Lara had predicted, a soft, angry red glow emanated from deep within, where the thermal regulator was overheating. "The space is less than 10 centimeters wide," Kalen's voice stated in her mind. "The ambient temperature is 90 degrees Celsius. Contact with a live conduit will be fatal." "I'm aware," Lara said, stripping off her jacket. She wrapped her arm in a heat-resistant sleeve from her pack and approached the machine. The heat washed over her face. She took a breath, focused, and plunged her arm into the tight space. Her fingers, guided by memory and the wireframe schematic projected by her cyber eye, navigated the maze of hot wires. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Kalen stood behind her, a silent, monstrous statue. He could have crushed her without a thought, yet here he was, trusting her with the lungs of his sanctuary. She found the bypass switch. It was tiny, almost fused to its housing by the heat. She nudged it with her fingertip, again and again, until with a faint click, it moved. The angry red glow subsided, replaced by a steady, healthy blue. The groaning of the machine eased into a stable, powerful hum. Lara pulled her arm out. It was red and trembling, but unharmed. She had done it. Without a word, Kalen turned and led her to a small, sealed room off a service corridor. It was once a security monitoring station. It contained a cot, a functioning terminal, and an air circulator. "Your quarters," the voice announced. "You will have access to the archives through this terminal. You will not leave this sector. Food paste is dispensed at 0800 and 2000 hours. This door will remain locked." The heavy steel door slid shut with a deafening thud, the lock engaging with a final, solid clank. She was a prisoner. A prisoner by choice. She sank onto the cot, her body screaming with exhaustion and adrenaline. She was in. She had passed the test. She booted up the terminal. The screen flickered to life, displaying a single line of stark, white text. "Archives, Biointegration and Cybernetic Pathology. Access granted." Her work had just begun. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle. Research. Eat. Sleep. Repeat. She devoured Kalen's archives, a dizzying collection of research papers, failed experiments, and theoretical models. The sheer brilliance of the mind behind it all was staggering. It was also terrifying. She saw the path he had walked, the obsessive pursuit of knowledge that had led him to sacrifice everything. He never spoke to her directly. Their only communication was through the terminal. He would occasionally highlight a relevant file or add a cryptic annotation to her work. They were two minds, touching across a digital void. She was the ghost in his machine, just as she promised. But she was also a junker. And a junker is always curious. When she wasn't researching the phage, she was probing the rest of the tower's network. Most of it was firewalled, but she found a back door, a corrupted subdirectory labeled personal logs, decommissioned. Inside were fragmented files, most unreadable. But one evening, she managed to decrypt and open one. It wasn't a text file. It was an image. A simulation. On her screen, a single, perfect rose bloomed into existence. It was a deep, velvet red, its petals impossibly detailed, a faint shimmer of dew on their edges. It rotated slowly in the void, a thing of breathtaking, organic beauty in this world of cold, hard logic. The file name was simple, Memoria.7. A soft chime indicated an incoming message from the system administrator. From Kalen. You are outside your designated parameters. The file on her screen vanished. But the image was burned into her mind. It was the first crack in his armor. The first hint of a ghost of a man, not just a machine. The discovery of the holographic rose changed something fundamental in their dynamic. The silence from Kalen's end of the network was now heavier, freighted with an unspoken history. Lara found herself thinking less about the monster and more about the man who would save a file like that. Who was he, before the chrome and the code? Her research into the phage intensified, but now it was a collaborative effort. He started correcting her hypotheses, not with curt dismissals, but with complex equations and alternate theories. He would dump massive files into her shared folder, pre-collapse case studies. Molecular diagrams, his own failed simulations. It was his version of a conversation. A meeting of minds across a gulf of static and steel. Your approach is too sympathetic, his text scrolled across her screen one cycle. You seek to repair the host-implant bond. This is sentimental. The host is the flaw. The biological component is too unpredictable. The host is the point, Lara typed back, her fingers flying across the holographic keys. What good is the machine if the person inside is dead? The bond is everything. An inefficient perspective. True survival demands the elimination of sentimental variables. Maybe true living requires them, she retorted, and hit send before she could second-guess herself. For a full minute, there was no reply. She thought she had pushed too far. Then, a new message. Your logic is flawed, but your processing speed is adequate. Consider the protein folding in file 74B, there is an anomaly there you have overlooked. It was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever given her. A small, almost imperceptible shift. The Spectre was watching her, testing her, and perhaps, in his own clinical way, starting to rely on her. The monster was still a monster, but now, she could see the faint outlines of his cage. He hadn't been cursed by an outside force. He had built his prison himself, brick by logical brick. The breakthrough came a week later, in the form of a system-wide power surge. The lights in Lara's cell flickered violently, and the terminal died. The air circulation cut out, and the oppressive silence of the tower returned, thicker than before. A klaxon, a real, audible alarm, began to blare. Main power grid, cascade failure imminent. Manual reboot required at primary conjunction. The steel door to her cell hissed open. Kalen stood there, a hulking silhouette against the flashing red emergency lights. Your assistance is required, his voice rasped in her head. The reboot sequence requires 2 operators. My manipulators lack the finesse for the coolant pin insertion. For the first time since her arrival, she would be working alongside him. In the flesh. He led her to the heart of the tower, a vast, cylindrical chamber that housed the fusion core. It was a breathtaking, terrifying space. A miniature sun, contained by shimmering magnetic fields, pulsed at the center. The heat was immense. "We have 3 minutes before the magnetic containment fails," he stated, his voice flat despite the apocalyptic stakes. "You will release the primary coolant valves on my command. I will initiate the reboot sequence. Do not deviate." They took their positions on opposite sides of the core's control console. It was the first time she had been this close to him for this long. She could see the intricate scarring on the human side of his face, the way his single organic eye was fixed on the readouts with an intensity that was utterly human. She could smell the ozone radiating from his chassis, see the subtle twitch of wires deep within his metallic limbs. He was a paradox of life and death, of man and machine, standing on the precipice of annihilation. Now, his voice commanded. Lara slammed her hands down on the valve controls. A wave of supercooled nitrogen flooded the system. On the far side, Kalen's more humanoid hand flew across a control panel, a blur of motion. The core's violent pulsing began to stabilize. The klaxon died. The emergency lights were replaced by a steady, white glow. He had saved them. They had saved them. Lara sagged against the console, her legs weak with relief. She looked up at him. His chest, a solid plate of chrome, rose and fell in a simulation of breath. His human eye was closed. In that moment, in the quiet aftermath, he didn't look like a monster. He just looked tired. Impossibly, achingly tired. He opened his eye and it met hers. There was no static, no command in her head. Just a shared look across a silent room. An acknowledgement. Two beings, one of flesh and one of steel, had held back the darkness together. And in that shared silence, the walls of his prison seemed to shrink, just a little. The shared crisis of the core meltdown irrevocably altered the space between them. The lock on her door was disengaged. She was no longer confined to her sector. He still communicated primarily through the network. But the messages were different now, less formal. He would ask for her analytical input on non-medical systems, hydroponics, atmospheric processors. He was, in his own way, inviting her into his world. She began to explore the silent, dust-choked upper levels of the tower. She found observation decks with panoramic views of the poisoned world, the lights of Néo-Paris a distant, hazy glow. She found abandoned laboratories filled with strange, beautiful glass instruments. She found a private study, Spartan and neat, with a single chair facing a massive, dark window. On a small table next to it was a metallic frame, designed to hold a picture that was no longer there. In this study, she found his personal terminal. It was not firewalled. It was an invitation. Hesitantly, she accessed it. There were no research papers here. Only personal files. Music, classical symphonies, long forgotten. Poetry. And a journal. The entries were from before the accident. They were written by a man named Dr. Kalen Arnaud. A man who wrote about the beauty of protein structures as if they were sonnets. A man who worried about the ethics of his work for Omnivie. A man who described walking through the Jardin du Luxembourg on a spring day, and the precise shade of red of a particular rose he saw there. Memoria. 7, she realized. It wasn't just a simulation. It was a memory. A new message appeared on the screen, from the tower's main administrator. From him. The past is irrelevant data. Is it? Lara typed back. Or is it the source code? The code was flawed. It was rewritten. You didn't rewrite it, she sent, her heart aching for the man who wrote these logs. You just deleted the comments. The terminal went blank. She thought she had angered him, trespassed too far. She returned to her research, a new sense of urgency filling her. She wasn't just fighting for Cora anymore. She was fighting for the ghost of Kaylin Arnaud, too. It was in his old, discarded notes on cellular regeneration that she found the key. He had been trying to force the body to accept the machine. It was the wrong approach. The solution wasn't to force a bond, but to create a bridge. A programmable bacteriophage that could act as a translator between organic and synthetic systems, teaching the body that the implant was not a foreign invader, but a part of itself. She worked feverishly, Kaylin's silent assistance a constant presence. He would refine her code, run simulations at speed she couldn't comprehend, and provide the complex biochemical formulas she needed. They were a team. One mind, split across two bodies, one of metal, one of flesh. The night she finished the final sequence, a quiet sense of triumph filled her small room. The algorithm was complete. It was elegant, it was beautiful, and it was, according to every simulation, a success. She sent the completed file to him, with a simple message. Done. His reply came instantly. It is elegant, and then, after a pause. A cure is a single data point. Application is the true test. Your sister. What is her status? It was the first time he had asked. The first time he had acknowledged Cora as a person. Before Lara could formulate a reply, her personal comms unit, silent for weeks, chirped to life. It was a message from the Undercity, from Laurent. The text was garbled, broken by static, but the words she could make out were like ice in her veins. Cascade critical. Palliative. Lara, she's asking for you. Cora was dying. Not in months, but now. As if the world itself was conspiring against her, a new alarm, one she had never heard before, shrieked through the tower. It was a proximity alert. An intrusion. Kaylin's voice filled her head, stripped of all its recent softness, back to the cold, hard command of their first meeting. OmniVE Solutions. They have found me. Perimeter breached at level 5. The cure was in her hands. And the hunters were at the door. The fairy tale was over. Seal the tower. Initiate the system wipe. Kaylin's voice was a flat line of code in her mind, a final, logical conclusion. The research must not fall into their hands. Annihilation is the only tactical solution. Lara ran from her room, her boots echoing in the suddenly hostile corridors. She found him in the command center, the vast chamber that overlooked the fusion core. He stood before the main console, his monstrous form silhouetted against a schematic of the tower flashing with red intrusion alerts. OmniVE soldiers, depicted as red triangles, were swarming the lower levels. No, she shouted, her voice real and raw. Kaylin, no. We have the cure. The cure is irrelevant, his voice transmitted, even as his physical form remained motionless. The probability of them weaponizing the base algorithm is 87.4%. The probability of you escaping to administer it is 12.1%. The logical course is to eliminate all variables. A clean slate. He reached his metallic hand toward a large, covered panel on the console. The self-destruct. Your logic is broken. Lara sprinted and planted herself between him and the console, her small frame a pathetic barrier against his. What about your logic when you saved that rose? When you helped me? Was that just eliminating variables? Or was that you? His hand paused, hovering over the panel. His human eye fixed on her. That was an error. A ghost in the machine. It's not a ghost, it's you, she pleaded, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the grime. I read your journals. I know who you were. Kaylin Arnaud wouldn't hide behind logic. He wouldn't sacrifice the one life he could save for the sake of sterile pride. What is the point of all this, of your sacrifice, of your entire miserable existence in this tower, if it doesn't save one person? She thrust her datapad, glowing with the cure's perfect code, at him. She is dying. My sister. Her name is Cora. She's 16. She loves real apples and hates the smell of ozone. She is not a variable. She is a person. And she is waiting for me. Your research is meaningless without her. You are meaningless without this. The red triangles on the schematic were getting closer. Gunshots echoed from the levels below. He looked from Lara's desperate, tear-streaked face to the glowing datapad, then back. The war was not with the soldiers below. It was here, in this room, between a man's cold logic and a woman's fierce, illogical hope. His human eye squeezed shut. The distorted rasp of his vocal synthesizer crackled in the real world, a sound she had never heard him use to speak. Ilara. Her name. Spoken. Not transmitted. It was a broken, grinding sound, but it was his. His hand pulled back from the self-destruct panel. With a surge of furious motion, he slammed his fist on another console. Bulkheads throughout the lower levels slammed shut. Automated defenses, dormant for decades, hummed to life. The schematic lit up with new icons, blue circles meeting the red triangles. He turned his full, terrifying form toward the entrance of the command center. They want their property back, his voice transmitted, cold again, but with a new undercurrent. Not of despair, but of purpose. Let us show them the price of reclamation. He was choosing to fight. Not for logic, not for his research, but for her. For Cora. The ghost in the machine had picked a side. Current part ziggurat characters, 3508. Total characters, 34422. The battle for the spire was a symphony of chaos. The air filled with the shriek of ricocheting plasma bolts and the deep, resonant boom of Kalen's heavy footfalls. He moved with a speed and brutality that was terrifying to behold. His clawed arm, which Lara had only seen perform delicate, if clumsy, tasks, now tore through steel bulkheads as if they were paper. He was not a scientist in a shell, he was a walking tank, a relic of a war he tried to prevent, now unleashed. Lara was not a soldier, but she was a survivor. While Kalen was the battering ram, she was the scalpel. Darting between cover, she used her technical knowledge as a weapon. She overloaded junction boxes to create blinding flashes of light, triggered fire suppression systems to fill corridors with disorienting foam, and hacked the Omnivi soldiers' comms, feeding them ghost signals and false orders. They were a perfect, deadly team. They fought their way down, clearing level by level. The Omnivi soldiers, with their sleek corporate armor and identical pulse rifles, were efficient but unprepared for the sheer ferocity of the tower's master. They had come expecting to subdue a decrepit recluse, not to fight a demigod in its own temple. In a vast server farm, they were pinned down. A dozen soldiers had taken fortified positions behind racks of humming machinery. Kalen took the brunt of the fire, his chrome chassis sparking and groaning as plasma bolts scored deep gouges in the metal. My power. Cells are failing, his voice stated in her mind, a calm report in the midst of a firefight. Main chassis integrity at 42%. Just hold them off. Lara yelled, her fingers flying as she jacked her personal datapad into a server rack. She wasn't trying to hack their guns, she was hacking the room itself. The massive cooling systems for the servers. With a final command, she reversed the flow. Instead of drawing heat out, the system began to pump it in. A blast of superheated air roared through the server farm. The soldiers cried out in shock, their armor's internal temperatures soaring to critical levels. Their disciplined assault broke as they scrambled to escape the sudden furnace. Kalen seized the opportunity. He charged through the heat haze, a terrifying specter of vengeance, and scattered their remaining forces. The server farm was theirs. But the victory was costly. Kalen leaned against a rack, his entire frame shuddering. A huge, gaping wound had been torn in his torso, revealing a tangle of severed wires and leaking hydraulic fluid. The single light in his human eye was dimming. Critical damage, his voice transmitted, weaker now. Core systems, compromised. I cannot maintain physical integrity. "We have to get you to the repair bay," Lara said, rushing to his side. "Negative," he replied. The transfer of the cure algorithm, a complex data packet, flashed onto her datapad. "There is insufficient time." He looked at her, his human eye finding hers. The fire within it was almost gone. "My research, your cure, it was an elegant solution." He reached out his humanoid hand, the metal fingers gently touching the datapad in her grasp. "A single data point. You were correct, Elara Vance. It is the only data that ever mattered." With a final, shuddering groan, he initiated a new command. Not a defensive one, but an internal one. Lights began to flash all over his body, a final, frantic surge of energy. "Kaelin, what are you doing?" she cried. "Upgrading," his voice whispered in her skull, and it was filled with a strange, new sound. A sound like peace. The hardware was obsolete. His physical body collapsed. The towering frame of chrome and steel fell to the ground with a deafening crash, silent and inert. The lights went out. All of them. He was gone. Lara stood frozen, the datapad with the cure clutched in her hand, her heart a cold, dead weight in her chest. She had won. And she had lost everything. The silence that fell in the wake of Kaelin's collapse was more profound than any noise. Lara stared at the empty husk, the discarded shell of the being who had saved her. Grief, sharp and overwhelming, threatened to buckle her knees. But the sound of distant, regrouping soldiers shocked her back to the present. She couldn't stay. His sacrifice would be for nothing if she died here. She gave the fallen form one last look, whispered a "thank you" to the empty air, and ran. She fled through the broken corridors of the tower. A ghost leaving a tomb for the second time. She made it to the ground floor and slipped out through the same shattered window she had entered, back into the gray, toxic twilight of the static zones. The tower, the mighty Tour Montparnasse, stood silent at her back, no longer a place of menace or hope, but just a grave. A grave for a brilliant man and a terrible monster, who in the end, had been one and the same. The journey back was a blur of exhaustion and sorrow. The dangers of the static zone seemed trivial now, the rogue drones and toxic pools nothing compared to the battle she had just survived. Her body moved on autopilot, driven by a single, burning purpose, Cora. When she finally stumbled into the Undercity, she was caked in grime and dried blood, her eyes hollow. She went straight to Lawrence Clinic. The old doctor looked up, his eyes widening in shock as she burst through the door. "She's in the back," he said. "No questions asked." Lara found her sister in a sterile white room, hooked up to a life support monitor that was tracing a weak, faltering line. Cora was unconscious, her face ashen. The chrome phage was winning. "Not yet," Lara whispered, pulling out her datapad. She loaded the cure, Kaelin's final, elegant solution, into a clean medical injector. The bacteriophage algorithm was a work of art, a living key designed to unlock the prison of Cora's own body. With a shaking hand, she administered the injection into her sister's dataport. For a moment, nothing happened. The line on the monitor remained faint. Lara's hope, a tiny, flickering flame, began to die. And then, the light on Cora's temple, which had been a sickly, flickering red, turned a steady, calm blue. The seizure-like tremors that had been plaguing her subsided. The weak line on the heart monitor strengthened, finding a slow, steady rhythm. Tears of relief, of grief, of profound, aching exhaustion, streamed down Lara's face. She collapsed into the chair by Cora's bed, her mission complete. She had done it. She had walked into the monster's lair and stolen a miracle. Weeks passed. Cora's recovery was slow, but steady. The color returned to her cheeks. The light of cognition returned to her eyes. The phage was in remission. The new bacteriophages silently rewriting the conflict between her flesh and her implants into a symbiotic harmony. The Undercity was the same. The rain was still acid, the noodles still smelled of synthetic onions, the struggle for survival was still a daily battle. But for Laura, the world had fundamentally shifted. The silence from the spire was a constant presence in her thoughts. She had saved her sister. But she felt a profound loneliness, a missing piece in her own code. One evening, she and a recovering Cora stood on a small, railed balcony overlooking one of the Undercity's vast, open caverns. Above, the glow panels simulated a starry night sky. He would have liked to see this, Cora said softly, her voice still weak but clear. Lara had told her everything. About the tower, the monster, the man. He would have said it was an inefficient use of photons, Lara replied. A sad smile touching her lips. As she spoke, her personal datapad, which had been silent for weeks, chimed with a new message. It was anonymous. Untraceable. Encrypted with a key she had never seen before, yet her device opened it instantly. The message contained no words. It was just a single, perfect, holographic image. A rose. Deep red, its petals shimmering, rotating slowly in the digital space. Lara gasped. Her heart, which had felt so heavy, so empty, suddenly felt a jolt of impossible, illogical hope. He wasn't gone. Not completely. The man was dead. The monster was dead. But the ghost, the Spectre de Montparnasse, was still in the machine. He had shed his obsolete hardware. He had become his own sanctuary. She looked up, past the simulated stars, as if she could see through the miles of rock and concrete to the dark, silent tower that dominated the skyline. She was not alone. He was out there, a silent guardian in a tomb of wires and code. A digital ghost, forever watching over the city that had forsaken him, and the one woman who had seen the man inside. The rain had not stopped, but for the first time in a long time, Lara felt the promise of a clear sky. Story 2. How does a soul learn its own shape? Not in the cool, measured light of a church, nor in the stifling, starched white propriety of a colonial drawing room. A soul learns its shape in the shadows, in the secret hours when the world is asleep and the only sound is the thirsty rasp of charcoal on stolen paper. For Isabelle Lynn Du Bois, her soul was a thing of sharp angles and turbulent colors, a chaotic storm she could only glimpse in the attic of her father's grand Hanoi villa. By day, she was a ghost in her own home, a silent governess to a French child who was not her sister, living under the cool, appraising gaze of a man who was her father but would never claim her as a daughter. Her posture was a masterclass in self-effacement, her voice a murmur, her eyes perpetually downcast. She was Isabelle, a useful, quiet fixture. But by night, she was Lynn. The air in her attic room was thick with the scent of turpentine and the sweet, cloying perfume of the frangipani tree outside her window, a scent of freedom and decay. Here, under a single bare bulb that cast her shadow long and monstrous on the slanted ceiling, she would unpin her hair, letting the straight, black curtain of it fall over her shoulders. It was her mother's hair, a defiant banner of the heritage her father sought to scrub from her. Here, the rigid discipline taught by the nuns at the mission melted away, her spine curving with concentration, her hands, finally, remembering their purpose. Tonight, she worked on a piece that had consumed her for weeks. It was a large sheet of packing paper, smoothed and weighted at the corners with books. On it, a sky churned. Not the gentle, pastel sky of the French watercolorists her father admired, but a sky of violent purples and bruised indigos, slashed through with a defiant, furious streak of crimson lacquer. It was the sky she saw behind her eyelids during her father's clipped, dismissive monologues at the dinner table. It was the color of a scream trapped in her throat. She called it the lacquer-stained sky. Her fingers, smudged with black and violet, moved with a desperate, frantic grace. This was not a hobby, it was an exorcism. Each stroke was a word she could not speak, each color a feeling she was forbidden to own. Here, in the humid dark, Lynn let her soul breathe, giving it the monstrous, beautiful, terrible shape she knew to be her own. Below, the house was silent. Monsieur Auguste Du Bois, her father, would be asleep, his world one of perfect, sterile order. He would never dream that directly above his head, chaos was being born on a sheet of discarded paper. A rebellion taking root in the heart of the daughter he thought he had so perfectly tamed. The next morning, the sun rose with a white, punishing glare, bleaching the vibrant colors from the city and from Lin's spirit. She was Isabel again. Her hair was imprisoned in its tight chignon, her face powdered to hide the small, crescent-shaped mole her father despised, her hands scrubbed raw but still bearing the faint stains of pigment under her fingernails. Breakfast was a silent, tense ritual. Monsieur Dubois sat at the head of the long mahogany table, hidden behind a copy of Le Courrier de Haiphong. The air was cool, conditioned by the slow turning of the ceiling fan, but Lin felt a suffocating heat. She was tutoring 7-year-old Adeline, the daughter of a visiting official, and her father expected a report. Adeline has mastered her cursive G, Lin said, her voice barely disturbing the air. We will begin multiplication this afternoon. Dubois lowered his paper. His eyes, the color of a pale winter sea, fixed on her. They held no warmth, only a meticulous assessment, as if he were examining a piece of porcelain for flaws. Excellent. Discipline is the foundation of a civilized mind. Remember that. The words were not for Adeline. They were for her. Every word he spoke was a lesson, a reinforcement of the bars of her gilded cage. He was obsessed with order, with the pristine facade of his life as a high-ranking administrator in French Indochina. She, his illegitimate con-guy, was the single greatest threat to that order. Her existence was a secret he managed with cold efficiency, her presence in his house a carefully calculated act of charity that was, in reality, a form of imprisonment. That afternoon, while Adeline napped, Lin found herself with a rare moment of solitude in the library. It was her father's domain, a room that smelled of old leather and his cigar smoke. She was not supposed to be there, but she was drawn to the newspapers he left behind. Her French was perfect, a tool honed by the mission nuns, and she scanned the pages, not for news of Paris or politics, but for the small, insignificant columns on culture. And then she saw it. A small block of text, tucked away at the bottom of a page. Asterisk Galerie Elodie. And once. La Galerie accepte les soumissions pour notre salon annuel d'artistes nouveaux. Asterisk The gallery was accepting submissions for its annual salon of new artists. Lin's heart began to beat a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. Galerie Elodie was a small, almost scandalous establishment in the French Quarter, known for showcasing avant-garde work that the mainstream colonial society dismissed as degenerate. It was a world away from her own, a world she had only read about with a desperate, painful longing. The deadline was in 2 days. The idea was insane. A fantasy. To submit her work was to risk everything. Her father's fury would be biblical. Discovery would not just mean punishment, it would mean annihilation. He would cast her out without a second thought, and the world outside the villa walls was a place she had been taught to fear. Yet, the thought of the lacquer-stained sky hanging on a real gallery wall, seen by eyes other than her own, it was a drop of water to a woman dying of thirst. For the rest of the day, a war raged within her. The demure, obedient Isabel counseled caution, whispered of duty and safety. But the fierce, hungry Lin, the artist in the attic, screamed for a chance to be seen. That night, sleep offered no escape. She dreamt of her painting, hanging in a bright room, and as people looked at it, the crimson streak of lacquer began to bleed, dripping from the frame onto the pristine gallery floor, a stain that could never be erased. She woke with her decision made, her body trembling not with fear, but with a terrifying, exhilarating resolve. The next day, Lin moved as if in a trance, her actions dictated by a will that felt both foreign and deeply her own. Getting the painting out of the villa was the first hurdle. She waited until the hour of the siesta, when the entire city seemed to sink into a humid, heat-induced torpor. Her father was at his office, the household staff drowsing in the kitchen quarters. She carefully rolled the lacquer-stained sky and slid it into a long, cardboard tube meant for architectural drawings she'd found in a storage closet. Her hands shook as she wrote the submission details on a simple tag. She could not use her own name, not Isabelle and certainly not Du Bois. The name came to her in a flash of defiant inspiration, a name that was both a shield and a truth, Kujao Mat. The Faceless One. With the tube clutched under her arm, she slipped out of the villa's back gate. The heat hit her like a physical blow. The French Quarter was quiet. Its wide boulevards shaded by tamarind trees. The air was still. But as she walked, the sounds of the city began to change. The polite murmur of French gave way to the tonal cascade of Vietnamese. The scent of perfume was replaced by the pungent, delicious smells of street food, lemongrass, grilling pork, star anise from steaming bowls of pho. She had crossed an invisible line into the old quarter, a place her father had forbidden her from ever visiting alone. Here, the city was alive, a chaotic, vibrant labyrinth of narrow streets. Bicycles and cyclos swarmed around her. The sheer density of life was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the sterile emptiness of her father's house. For a moment, she was paralyzed by fear. Every glance felt like an accusation. But the weight of the tube under her arm propelled her forward. Galerie Elodie was on a street that marked the border between the two worlds. It was a modest storefront, its window displaying a single, stark sculpture of twisted metal that seemed to offend the elegant colonial architecture surrounding it. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Lynn pushed open the door. A small bell chimed. The air inside was cool and smelled of oil paints and dust. The gallery was empty save for a woman sitting behind a small desk, a plume of cigarette smoke curling around her head. She had sharp, intelligent eyes and a mouth set in a line of perpetual cynicism. This had to be Madame Elodie. Lynn could not speak. She felt as if she had stepped onto a stage, the spotlight finding every one of her insecurities. She simply walked to the desk and placed the tube upon it. Madame Elodie eyed the tube, then looked at Lynn, her gaze lingering for a moment on Lynn's pristine white-out eye. A garment of traditional Vietnamese style her father forced her to wear when tutoring, a costume, in his eyes, befitting a native governess. "For the salon?" the woman asked, her voice raspy from smoke. Lynn could only nod, her throat tight. The woman took the tube, her movements brisk and dismissive. She didn't open it. She simply attached the tag to a list on a clipboard. "We will notify those selected. Do not call us." And that was it. Lynn was dismissed. She stumbled back out into the blinding sunlight, feeling dizzy and hollow. The entire transaction had taken less than a minute. She had risked everything for a nod and a clipped sentence. As she hurried back toward the sterile safety of the French Quarter, she felt a profound sense of shame, as if she had been caught playing a foolish child's game. The defiant artist of the attic had shrunk back into the timid governess, and she was certain she would never hear from the Galerie Elodie again. Weeks passed. The monsoonal humidity settled over Hanoi, a heavy, wet blanket that seemed to amplify the silence in the Du Bois villa. Lynn's brief, desperate act of rebellion began to feel like a fever dream. No letter came from the gallery. The world continued as it was, ordered and predictable. The colors of her secret painting seemed to fade, their passion muted by the relentless gray of her daily existence. The night of the salon opening came and went. Lynn lay awake in her attic room, staring at the ceiling, imagining the chatter of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, the way the light would fall on the art. She felt a profound and aching loneliness, a grief for a life she was too cowardly to claim. A few days later, at dinner, the first tremor was felt. Monsieur Du Bois had a guest, a fellow administrator named Monsieur Thiers, a portly man with a booming voice and an unshakable sense of his own importance. And the salon at Elodie's was the usual affair, Thiers was saying, gesturing with his wine glass. An assault on the senses. Nothing but incoherent splashes of paint. A complete lack of classical discipline. Du Bois nodded, dabbing his lips with a linen napkin. Elodie caters to the decadent. She mistakes novelty for genius. Quite. But there was one piece, Thiers continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. Anonymous. Or rather, signed with some local gibberish. Kujau Mat. Frightfully dramatic. He chuckled. Lin's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Her blood ran cold. It was a sky, Pierre elaborated. A monstrous, savage thing. All dark blues and purples. But there was a streak of red across it, lacquer, I think. Bizarre. But I will admit, it had a certain raw power. Unsettling. The sort of thing a native might paint if you gave him a European canvas. All feeling, no form. Dubois's gaze, sharp and sudden, lifted from his plate and settled on his daughter. It was not a look of accusation, not yet. It was a look of sudden, chilling calculation. He had seen the colors she used, the small pots of pigment she tried to hide. He had commented on the savage quality of her private sketches, the ones he discovered during one of his inspections of her room. Lin's face was a perfect, placid mask, a skill she had perfected over years of practice. But inside, her heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel his suspicion coiling in the air between them. Indeed, Dubois said. His voice dangerously smooth as he turned back to his guest. A reflection of a chaotic mind, no doubt. The very thing civilization is meant to temper. He picked up his wine glass, his eyes still on Lin over the rim. Isabel, you've been quiet this evening. Are you feeling well? Yes, Papa, she whispered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. I am quite well. He held her gaze for a moment longer. A silent assertion of his authority, before turning back to his guest. But the warning had been delivered. He was watching. The secret world of the attic was no longer safe. The ghost she had tried to be was beginning to take on a form he recognized, and he would not tolerate it. That night, for the first time, Lin was too afraid to paint. She simply sat in her room, the door wedged shut with a chair, and stared at the blank wall, the vibrant colors of her soul trapped and silent within her. The city's pulse seemed to beat in time with Lin's anxiety. A week after the dinner with Thierry, Lin was tasked with an errand, to procure a specific brand of French ribbon for Adeline's hair from a haberdashery in the French Quarter. It was a rare, sanctioned trip outside the villa walls. She kept her head down. Her movements swift, her only desire to complete the task and retreat back into the familiar shadows of her prison. As she stepped out of the shop, a voice called her name. Not Isabel, but Lin. The name sounded foreign and startling in the open air. She turned. A young man stood before her, his expression intense and intelligent. He was Vietnamese, dressed not in the traditional garb of a laborer, but in the simple trousers and collared shirt of a student. He held a small, worn book of poetry in his hand. Forgive my boldness, he said, his French accented but precise. I believe we are looking for the same person. He paused, his eyes searching hers. We are looking for Kujau Mat. Lin's breath caught in her throat. This was impossible. How could he know? She took a step back, ready to flee. Please. Don't be afraid, he said, his voice softening. My name is Bao. I am a student. A poet. I was at the gallery. I saw your painting. He gestured with the book. What you said with your colors, other artists, they try to say it with words, but they fail. She stared at him, speechless. He wasn't mocking her. There was a fire in his eyes, a genuine, fervent admiration that she had never encountered before. How did you find me? She finally managed to ask. Her voice a reedy whisper. The gallery delivery log was not as private as Madame Elodie might think, he admitted with a wry smile. A friend who works there owed me a favor. He gave me a name and an address. I have been walking past your villa for days, hoping to see you. This was a new kind of danger, different from her father's cold anger. This was the danger of being seen, of being understood. It was both terrifying and intoxicating. That painting, Bao continued, his voice dropping, becoming more urgent. It is not French. It is not traditional. It is new. It is the howl of our city, of our generation, caught between two worlds and belonging to neither. It is a true thing. He saw. He saw it all. He didn't see a savage thing, or a monstrous sky. He saw a truth. Tears pricked at the back of Lynn's eyes. And she fought them down fiercely. I cannot speak about this, she said, clutching the bag of ribbons like a shield. You must forget you saw me. You must not speak of this to anyone. She turned to leave, but his next words stopped her. To deny that art is to deny your own breath. I will not tell your secret. But I will not forget it. If you ever wish to speak with someone who understands what it is to have a voice that others wish to silence, you know where to find me. He gestured vaguely towards the labyrinthine streets of the old quarter. Ask for the poet Bao at the Quncu bookshop. Any student can show you. He gave her a final, respectful nod and then melted back into the flow of the street, leaving Lynn standing on the pavement, her heart a wild, chaotic drum against her ribs. He had given her a name and a place. A key to a door she never knew existed. For the first time, the old quarter was not just a forbidden zone, it was a possibility. A place where she might not be faceless after all. The encounter with Bao lit a small, defiant flame in the cold expanse of Lynn's fear. His words echoed in her mind, a counter-melody to her father's constant refrain of discipline and control. A voice that others wished to silence. He had seen her not as a flawed daughter or a native curiosity, but as a fellow artist, a creator. This newfound courage, fragile as it was, propelled her to do something even more reckless than submitting her painting. She decided to go back to the gallery Elodie. She had to know what the woman with the cynical eyes truly thought, away from the dismissive transaction of the submission. She used another errand, this time for medicinal herbs, as her excuse, a journey that took her legitimately closer to the gallery's location. Pushing open the door for the second time, she found the gallery just as it was before, quiet, dusty, and smelling of solvents. Madame Elodie was at her desk, engrossed in a ledger, the ever-present cigarette dangling from her lips. She looked up as the bell chimed, and a flicker of recognition crossed her features. The governess, she said, her tone flat. I hope you are not here to inquire about the salon. It is over. I know, Lynn said, surprised at the steadiness of her own voice. I am, Kujao Mat. Madame Elodie raised a skeptical eyebrow. She leaned back in her chair, smoke curling from her nostrils, and studied Lynn from head to toe. She looked at the modest, well-made Aodai, the severely pinned hair, the posture of submission. There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Really, Elodie finally said. Her voice laced with disbelief. You. I would have imagined someone, angrier. I am, Lynn replied, the simple word hanging in the air with the weight of years of suppressed emotion. Elodie seemed to consider this. She crushed her cigarette in a heavy glass ashtray and, for the first time, gestured for Lynn to come closer. Your painting. It caused a small stir. The collectors hated it, which is always a good sign. The critics were confused, which is even better. It had a violent honesty. Where did you learn to paint like that? I didn't learn, Lynn said. I just do. I see. Elodie's gaze was sharp, analytical. It was not the warm admiration of Bao, but a professional, almost brutal assessment. You have a raw, untutored talent, mademoiselle. It is a powerful thing. It is also, in a girl like you, an exquisitely dangerous one. Dangerous? Do you have any idea what this world does to talent when it is not accompanied by money, by connections, by the correct name? Elodie asked, her voice turning hard. It chews it up and spits it out. You live in the villa of Auguste Dubois. A man who values his reputation above all else. Do you truly believe he would tolerate a daughter who paints such savage truths? He would crush you. He would destroy that thing in you, not out of malice, but because for men like him, Order is God, and your art is blasphemy. The words were cruel, but they rang with an undeniable truth. They were a confirmation of Lin's deepest fears, spoken aloud by a stranger. So what should I do? Lin whispered, the fight draining out of her. Should I stop? Madame Elodie lit another cigarette. Most would. It is the sensible thing to do. Marry some clerk, have some children, and forget you ever had a soul that screamed in color. She took a long drag. But you came here. That tells me you are not entirely sensible. She looked at Lin, and for the first time, there was something other than cynicism in her eyes. It was not pity, but a kind of weary respect. I cannot help you. To champion you would be to invite the wrath of your father, and I am a businesswoman, not a martyr. But I will give you this piece of advice: if you choose this path, you must be prepared to lose everything you think is keeping you safe. Your home. Your father. Your security. Art demands a sacrifice. The question you must ask yourself is if you are willing to pay the price. Lin left the gallery with Madame Elodie's words ringing in her ears, a cold, hard stone in the pit of her stomach. Art demands a sacrifice. The choice was no longer an abstract fear, it was a tangible, terrifying equation. Her life, her security, for the chaos of her art. She returned to the villa to find that the equation had been decided for her. Monsieur Dubois summoned her to his study that evening. This was a rare occurrence, reserved for the most serious of pronouncements. The room was his sanctuary, paneled in dark wood, smelling of power and authority. He was not seated behind his large desk, but stood by the window, looking out into the perfectly manicured garden, his hands clasped behind his back. Isabelle, he began, his voice devoid of any emotion. I have been considering your future. Lin stood silently, her hands clammy, her heart a slow, heavy drum. You are 22 years old, he continued, still not looking at her. It is past time you were settled. I have a responsibility to see you secure. Living here, in this ambiguous position, is not a permanent solution. He turned, and his eyes pinned her in place. Monsieur Revel, the head of the Port Authority, has a son. His name is Charles. He is a junior administrator, a respectable young man with sound prospects. I have spoken with his father. An arrangement has been made. The air left Lin's lungs. An arrangement. The words were so sterile, so transactional. You will be married, Dubois stated. It was not a proposal. It was a verdict. Charles is a good, steady man. He will provide you with a home, a name, a respectable life. The life your mother could never have. The mention of her mother was a deliberate cruelty, a reminder of her origins, of the debt he believed she owed him. I have taken the liberty of accepting on your behalf, he said, a faint, triumphant smile touching his lips. You will meet him at dinner on Sunday. You will be charming. You will be grateful. This is the greatest gift I can give you, Isabelle. A chance to erase the unfortunate circumstances of your birth. A chance for a clean, orderly life. He saw this as an act of generosity. To Lin, it was a death sentence. To marry a man she did not know, to be locked away in a respectable life, to be Charles's wife, it meant the attic door would be locked forever. It meant the death of Lin, and the final, eternal victory of Isabelle, the ghost. Papa. Please, she began, her voice trembling. There is nothing to discuss, he cut her off, his voice turning to ice. My decision is final. You have been allowed to indulge your melancholic little hobbies for too long. I have seen the stains on your hands. The wildness in your drawings. This marriage will be a corrective. It will provide you with the structure you so clearly lack. He finally saw it. The art was not a hobby. It was a sickness he needed to cure. The marriage was his medicine. Do you understand me? He demanded. Lin looked at the man who was her father, at his cold, unyielding face. He was not offering her a future, he was erasing her. The choice Madame Elodie had spoken of was here, now, in this silent, suffocating room. Safety or self? Order or art? Yes, Papa, she whispered. The words felt like a betrayal, a surrender. But as she said them, a cold, hard resolve began to form in her heart. He had drawn his battle line. Now, she had to draw hers. She would meet Charles. She would play the part of the grateful daughter. But she would not surrender. The visit to Bao, the conversation with Elodie, they were no longer idle encounters. They were escape routes. The Sunday dinner was an ordeal of exquisite torture. Charles' revel was exactly as his name suggested, bland, soft and utterly devoid of sharp edges. He had a round, pleasant face, thinning hair, and a nervous habit of adjusting his tie. He spoke of administrative ledgers and shipping schedules with a dull passion that made Lin's mind numb. She was a perfect automaton. She smiled when Charles made a mild joke. She murmured her assent when he described the small but respectable house they would live in. She endured the feel of his damp hand when he patted hers on the table, a gesture of ownership that made her skin crawl. Monsieur Dubois presided over the dinner with an air of immense satisfaction. He looked at Lin as if she were a wild animal he had finally broken, a chaotic element now successfully contained. To him, this was the triumph of order. For Lin, it was the slow, methodical snuffing out of a flame. Isabelle has a quaint little talent for sketching, Dubois remarked to Charles. Over dessert. Flowers, birds. Very delicate. It keeps her occupied. How charming, Charles said, smiling vapidly at Lin. We must find a place for your little easel in the parlor. Lin felt a wave of nausea. Her art, her savage, screaming, truthful art, reduced to a quaint little talent, a decorative hobby to be displayed in a parlor. The condescension was so profound, so complete, that it snapped something within her. The fear that had held her paralyzed for so long was burned away by a clean, white-hot rage. She needed to see Bao. It took her 2 days to engineer an escape. She feigned a migraine, a common enough affliction in the oppressive heat, which earned her a day of reprieve from her duties with Adeline. Instead of lying in her darkened room, she slipped out the back gate, her heart pounding not with fear this time, but with a desperate, driving purpose. She navigated the labyrinth of the old quarter with a new confidence. The chaos no longer felt threatening, it felt like a promise. She found the Chuan-Siu bookshop tucked into a narrow alley, its entrance piled high with stacks of new and used books. The air inside smelled of paper and dust and revolution. She asked for Bao. A young man looked up from his reading and pointed toward the back. Bao was there, sitting at a small table with 2 other students, engaged in a low, intense conversation over glasses of tea. When he saw her, his eyes widened in surprise, and then lit up with a genuine warmth that felt like the sun on her face. He excused himself and led her to a quiet corner. I did not know if you would come, he said. He is marrying me off, Lin said, the words tumbling out of her. Stark and artless. To an administrator. A man who thinks my art is charming. Bao's expression hardened with understanding. He is trying to silence you. He is trying to erase me, she corrected. He wants me to be a wife in a parlor, sketching flowers. Bao was silent for a moment. Then he said, come with me. He led her from the bookshop, deeper into the maze of alleys, to a place she would never have found on her own. It was the upstairs room of a noodle shop, a space cleared for a clandestine gathering. About a dozen young men and women were crowded inside, some sitting on the floor, others leaning against the walls. A young woman was standing in the center, reading a poem from a sheet of paper. Her voice was strong, her words sharp and full of a painful beauty. Lin stood in the doorway, mesmerized. The air was thick with smoke and the energy of shared ideas. They were speaking in Vietnamese, a language Lin was fluent in but rarely used outside of the servants' quarters. Here, it was the language of art, of intellectual fervor. No one paid her any mind. She was not the governor's daughter, not a strange curiosity. She was just another body in a room full of people who cared about words and ideas and truths. For a few hours, she listened. They spoke of poetry, of politics, of a new Vietnam, of an identity that was not defined by the French or by the ancient, rigid traditions of the past. It was a world she never knew existed, a world of people like her, caught in the in-between. When it was over, she and Bao walked through the darkening streets. The paper lanterns were being lit, casting a warm, golden glow on the city. "You see," Bao said softly. "You are not alone. Your voice belongs here." In the sterile villa in the French Quarter, she was a ghost. In the stuffy, vibrant room above the noodle shop, she had felt, for the first time in her life, solid. Real. The choice was no longer abstract. She had seen the other side. She could not go back. The cost Madame Elodie had warned her about no longer seemed like a sacrifice. It seemed like a price worth paying. The taste of freedom, however brief, was ruinous to Lin's captivity. The walls of the villa, once merely oppressive, now felt actively hostile. The polite conversation at the dinner table, the scent of her father's cigars, the bland face of Charles Revel who now came to call twice a week, it all felt like a slow-acting poison. Her art was her only antidote. She began to paint again, but with a new, feverish intensity. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a desperate need to document her own existence before it was extinguished. Her work became bolder, the colors more violent, the lines more jagged. She painted the faces from the poetry reading, their eyes full of fire. She painted the tangled alleys of the old quarter, a landscape of beautiful, chaotic life. Her father, sensing this renewed surge of rebellion, tightened his grip. The wedding date was set. A dressmaker was summoned. Plans were made for the small, respectable ceremony that would seal Lin's fate. It felt like watching strangers arrange her funeral. The final confrontation happened on a Tuesday. Lin had been careless. A pot of crimson paint, the color of defiance, had spilled on the floor of her attic room, and she had failed to clean it up properly. Her father, making one of his unscheduled inspections while she was out with Adeline, found it. He was waiting for her in his study, the door ominously closed. On his pristine, polished desk lay a half-dozen of her recent paintings, which he must have found hidden under her mattress. They looked like wounds against the dark wood. "Explain these," he said. His voice was quiet, which was far more terrifying than if he had been shouting. Lin looked at her work. The face of Bao, rendered in sharp, angular strokes. A self-portrait where the mole under her eye was not a blemish, but a dark star. They were raw, honest, and utterly her own. "They are paintings, Papa." "They are not paintings," he hissed, his composure finally cracking. "They are a disease. A sickness of the mind. I offer you a life of dignity, of respect, and you hide in the attic like a rat, smearing filth on paper." He picked up the portrait of Bao. "And who is this?" "One of the rabble you consort with in the city, I presume." Lin remained silent, her chin held high. "I have been too patient," he said, his voice dropping again. "I believe that a firm hand and a respectable marriage would be enough to correct you. I see now that I was wrong. The sickness is deeper than I thought." He walked towards her, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "This ends now. You will be confined to your room until the wedding. You will see no one. After you are married to Charles, he will be instructed to ensure you never touch a brush again. I will burn these." He gestured to the paintings. "I will burn every last trace of this insanity." "No," Lin whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it. "What did you say?" "No," the word was stronger this time. She looked him directly in the eye. "You will not." For a moment, he looked genuinely stunned. The creature he had created to be silent and obedient was speaking. "You will not burn them," she repeated, her voice shaking but clear. "They are mine. They are the only part of me that is. He stared at her, and in his eyes she saw not anger, but a kind of revulsion, as if he were looking at something alien. He had lost control. And for a man like Auguste Dubois, loss of control was the ultimate failure. "You have made your choice," he said, his voice flat and dead. "You have chosen the gutter. Very well." He walked back to his desk and sat down, suddenly looking old and tired. "The engagement to Charles is terminated. You are no longer welcome in this house. Pack a bag. I want you gone by morning." He did not look at her again. He picked up a pen and began to work, as if she had already ceased to exist. The finality of it was absolute. He had not just thrown her out. He had erased her. Lynn stood there for a long moment, the world tilting on its axis. She was free. And she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She turned and walked out of the study, not to her attic room, but straight out the front door, with nothing but the clothes she was wearing. She did not look back. The front door of the villa clicked shut behind her. The sound as definitive as a gavel strike. Lynn stood on the wide, tree-lined avenue of the French Quarter, the familiar world now rendered alien and hostile. The setting sun cast long shadows that seemed to claw at her. She had no money, no possessions, no plan. Just the hollow, ringing echo of her father's verdict in her ears. "You have chosen the gutter." Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. She could go back, beg, promise to be the daughter he wanted. The thought was a brief, seductive poison. She could almost feel the cool, orderly silence of the villa reclaiming her. But then she remembered the look on his face as he condemned her paintings, the way he'd called her soul a disease. The memory was a bracing slap. She could not go back. To do so would be a suicide of the spirit. There was only one place to go. One name. Bao. Her feet carried her automatically toward the old quarter, a journey that had become a familiar secret. This time, however, she was not a visitor. She was a refugee. The vibrant chaos of the streets, once exhilarating, now seemed menacing. The crowds jostled her, the smells were overwhelming, the noise a physical assault. She was an outsider here, too, a well-dressed ghost adrift in a sea of life. She found the Uncu bookshop just as darkness was falling. The warm glow from its windows was a beacon. She pushed through the door, a mess of frayed nerves and quiet desperation. Bao was there, as she prayed he would be, sweeping the floor. He looked up, and the broom clattered from his hands. "Lynn. What has happened? You look." "He threw me out," she said, the words stark and brittle. "He found my paintings. The wedding is off. I have nowhere to go." Bao's face, which could be so full of fiery idealism, softened with a profound and gentle concern. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He took her by the arm, his touch firm and steadying, and led her through the shop to the small room in the back where he slept. It was tiny, barely big enough for a bedroll, a stack of books, and a small table. "You will stay here tonight," he said simply. "You are safe here." The simple declaration, "You are safe," was something Lynn had never truly heard before. In her father's house, she was secure, but never safe. The relief was so immense it buckled her knees, and she sank onto the edge of his bedroll, the tears she had refused to shed in her father's study finally coming in a silent, shuddering wave. Bao did not try to comfort her with words. He just made her a cup of hot, bitter tea, its warmth seeping into her cold hands. He sat on a stack of books opposite her, waiting patiently for the storm to pass. When she could finally speak, she told him everything, the confrontation, the ultimatum, the final, cold dismissal. He said he would burn them, she whispered, the thought still a physical pain. "My paintings." Bao's jaw tightened. A man who would burn art would burn people. "You are better off away from him." He paused, looking at her, his gaze unwavering. "This is a terrible night, Lynn. But it is also your first night of freedom. Do not forget that. Freedom. The word felt too big, too frightening. But as she sat there, in that tiny, book-filled room, sharing tea with the one person in the world who understood her, a small, fragile sense of truth began to dawn. Her father had taken everything from her, her home, her name, her security. But he could not take her art. He had inadvertently set it free. What will I do now, she asked, the question aimed at the universe. Now, Bao said, his voice firm with a conviction that bolstered her own, you will rest. And tomorrow, we will go and see Madame Elodie. It is one thing to be a businesswoman. It is another to let a true artist be swallowed by the gutter. The next morning, Lin woke to the sounds of the old quarter coming to life, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the sing-song calls of street vendors. It was a world away from the funereal silence of the villa. She felt raw and exposed, but the suffocating weight that had pressed down on her for years was gone. Bao was waiting for her with a bowl of rice porridge and another cup of tea. He had a plan. Or rather, a gamble. They walked to the Gallery Elodie together. The city looked different to Lin now. She was no longer a tourist in its vibrant heart, she was part of it, a piece of its uncertain, striving fabric. When they entered the gallery, Madame Elodie was in the middle of directing two workmen who were hanging a large, uninspired landscape. She turned, saw Lin standing beside Bao. And her eyebrows shot up. Good heavens, she said, dismissing the workman with a wave of her hand. The revolution has arrived at my doorstep. Bao, ever direct, stepped forward. Monsieur Dubois has disowned her. She has nothing. Elodie's cynical facade flickered. She looked at Lin's pale, determined face, at the simple clothes she'd worn for 2 days. She saw the truth of it. She took a long, deliberate drag from her cigarette. I told you, child. I told you art demands a sacrifice. I did not, however, expect you to pay the price so promptly. She was quiet for a long moment, the smoke curling around her head like a shroud. Lin's hope began to wither. She had been foolish to come here. Elodie was a businesswoman, not a savior. This is a very inconvenient situation, Elodie said finally, her voice raspy. To associate with you now would be a direct affront to one of the most powerful men in this city. It is bad for business. But her art, Bao started, his voice hot with indignation. Be quiet, boy, Elodie snapped, though without real venom. I am thinking. She paced the length of the gallery, her heels clicking on the wooden floor. She stopped in front of the empty space where the lacquer-stained sky had briefly hung. That painting, she mused, half to herself. It was trouble. But it was also the most honest thing I've seen in this gallery in 5 years. She turned and faced them. Her decision made. I will not be your patron. I will not give you handouts. But I am, against my better judgment, a gambler. Her eyes fixed on Lin. I will give you a space. A small storage room in the back. It is little more than a closet, but it is dry. I will provide you with canvas, with paints, with charcoal. Not the best, mind you, but they will suffice. In return, you will work. You will create a collection. Enough for a solo exhibition. Lin stared at her, stunned into silence. A solo exhibition. The idea was so audacious, so far beyond the realm of possibility, that she couldn't process it. Do not look so shocked, Elodie continued, her tone brisk again. This is not an act of charity. It is a wager. I am betting that your talent is greater than your father's influence. I am betting that this city, for all its colonial pretensions, is hungry for something real. If I win, the gallery thrives. If I lose, she shrugged. I have lost before. She then turned to Bao. And you? You will find a way to get the word out. Use your network of poets and malcontents. Create a buzz. Make Kujao Mata name people whisper about before they even see the work. It was a declaration of war, disguised as a business proposition. Elodie, the weary cynic, was taking the biggest risk of her career, spurred on by the raw talent of a disowned girl and the fiery idealism of a young revolutionary. "But my other paintings," Lynn said, her voice barely a whisper. "My father, he was going to burn them." "Then you will have to paint them again," Elodie said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Only better this time. Now, stop standing there looking tragic and get to work. The closet is through that door." The storage room was exactly as Elodie had described it, a closet. It was small and windowless, smelling faintly of dust and linseed oil. To Lynn, it was a palace. It was a kingdom. It was the first space in her entire life that was completely and utterly her own. For the first few days, she did nothing but sit on the floor of her new studio, breathing in the scent of her freedom. Bao found her a small room to rent nearby, in the attic of an old woman who sold soup in the street market. It was a sparse, simple space, but from its window, she could see the tangled, chaotic rooftops of the old quarter. The view was more beautiful to her than the most perfectly manicured garden. Then, she began to work. Elodie was true to her word, providing her with canvases, pigments, and brushes. The materials were cheap, the canvases rough, but they were a treasure. Freed from the fear of discovery, from the need to hide, something broke open in her art. The raw emotion that had always been present was now channeled through a new, more confident hand. She painted from memory, exorcising the ghosts of her past. She recreated the lacquer-stained sky, but this time the crimson streak was wider, more defiant. She painted the oppressive, geometric perfection of her father's villa, but from the outside, looking in, the windows like vacant eyes. She painted a portrait of Charles Revel, his face a perfect, featureless oval, a symbol of the hollow life she had escaped. But she was not just painting the past. She was painting her present. She painted the vibrant, chaotic energy of the street market below her window. She painted Bao, not just his face, but the fierce intelligence in his eyes, the way he used his hands when he spoke passionately about poetry. She painted Madame Elodie, surrounded by a halo of cigarette smoke, her cynical expression hiding a gambler's heart. Her life fell into a new rhythm. Mornings were for painting, the hours flying by in a blur of focused creation. Afternoons, she would walk through the city, truly seeing it for the first time, filling sketchbooks with the faces and shapes of her new world. Evenings were often spent with Bao and his friends, listening to their debates, absorbing their energy, feeling herself a part of something larger than her own small struggle. Her relationship with Bao deepened. It was a connection forged not in romance, but in a shared intellectual and artistic fire. He was her first and most honest critic, pushing her to be bolder, to dig deeper. He would bring her poems that mirrored the emotions in her paintings, and she would show him canvases that gave form to his words. They were two halves of a conversation, a dialogue about what it meant to be young and Vietnamese in a world that was trying to define them. One evening, he took her hand as they walked by Home Keem Lake. The tortoise tower a dark silhouette against the twilight sky. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a shock through her. It was not the proprietary pat of Charles Revel, but a touch of quiet companionship, of equal partnership. She did not pull away. Meanwhile, Bao was planting the seeds of her legend. He wrote articles for underground student newsletters, speaking of a mysterious, anonymous artist, Ko Jiao Mat, whose work was a new language for their generation. He spoke of her at poetry readings. He created a myth, a whisper that spread through the universities and cafes of the old quarter. He was building anticipation for a storm he knew was coming. Lynn, hidden away in her closet studio, simply worked, unaware of the legend being woven around her, focused only on the truth she was bringing to life on her canvases. Months bled into one another. The dry season gave way to the sticky heat of summer, and Lynn's collection grew. The small storage room was now filled with canvases, each one a testament to her journey. There were nearly 20 pieces, a body of work that was raw, emotional, and undeniably powerful. Madame Elodie, true to her cynical nature, rarely offered praise. She would enter the studio, purse her lips, circle a canvas, and point out a technical flaw or a moment of hesitation. "More courage here," she would say, tapping a section that was too timid. "Do not be afraid of the ugliness. There is truth in it." Her harsh critiques were more valuable to Lynn than any empty compliment. Elodie was not nurturing a student, she was forging a professional. One afternoon, Elodie entered the studio and stood for a long time in silence, surveying the collection. The air was thick with the smell of paint. Lynn, her hands and clothes stained with color, waited, her nerves taut. "It is enough," Elodie said finally. Her voice was flat, but her eyes held a spark that Lynn had never seen before. It was the glint of a gambler who believes she has a winning hand. "It is time." The plan was audacious. They would not attempt a traditional, lengthy exhibition. They could not afford the publicity, and it would give Monsieur Dubois too much time to shut them down. Instead, Elodie planned a single, secret event, unsolved. One night only. An invitation-only unveiling. "We will invite everyone," Elodie explained, pacing as she laid out her strategy. "The stuffy critics from the official papers, so they cannot claim they were excluded. The wealthy collectors I know are bored with landscapes. The French intellectuals who fancy themselves patrons of the exotic. And," she said, looking at Bao, who had just entered, "your entire network of young revolutionaries. Let us mix the oil and the water and see what ignites." The next 2 weeks were a blur of frantic, clandestine activity. Elodie used her social connections, sending out elegant, cryptic invitations that spoke of the unveiling of a significant new voice in Indo-Chinese art. Bao and his friends plastered the old quarter with discreet posters. Simple black sheets with white text, *KEGIUMT. Unsolved. Gallery Elodie, *. Lynn was a nervous wreck. She retreated into her work, putting the final touches on her paintings, her hands shaking. The night before the exhibition, she couldn't sleep. She sat in her studio, surrounded by her creations. They were her children, her ghosts, her confessions. Tomorrow, she would send them out into the world. And she had no idea if they would be embraced or destroyed. Bao found her there in the early hours of the morning. He didn't speak, just sat with her in the quiet darkness. "I am terrified," she confessed into the silence. "Good," he replied softly. "It means you are alive." He reached out and gently touched the crescent-shaped mole below her eye. For years, she had hidden it, powdered it over, a mark of shame. Bao traced its shape with his fingertip. "This is your signature," he said. "More than any name. Tonight, do not hide it." His words settled her. He was right. Tonight was not about hiding. It was about revealing. It was the end of Kujao Mat and the beginning of Lin. She took a deep breath, the scent of paint filling her lungs. It was the smell of battle, and for the first time, she felt ready. The night of the exhibition. The air in the gallery was electric. A humid breeze drifted in from the street, carrying the scent of rain and jasmine. Madame Elodie had transformed the space. The lighting was dramatic, casting deep shadows and highlighting the violent, vibrant colors of Lin's canvases. The crowd was a volatile, fascinating mix, just as she had planned. Stuffy French officials in white dinner jackets stood uncomfortably close to intense Vietnamese students in simple shirts. Wealthy colonial wives, dripping with pearls, whispered behind their fans, their eyes wide as they took in the raw, emotional art. Lin stood in the shadows of her former studio, watching through the cracked open door. She had followed Bao's advice, wearing a simple, dark dye and no powder to hide the mole on her cheek. She felt naked, exposed, every nerve ending tingling. Bao stood near the entrance. A silent guardian, while Elodie moved through the crowd like a shark, her cigarette holder a weapon, fielding questions and stoking intrigue. "Who is this artist?" "He is very angry, no," a French official boomed. "Perhaps she has a reason to be," Elodie replied coolly, before gliding away. The murmur grew. People were drawn to the work. They were shocked, confused, but captivated. They argued about it, debated its meaning. Lin's art was not a passive decoration, it was an active provocation. It was forcing a conversation in a city that preferred polite silence. Finally, Elodie tapped a glass for attention. The chatter subsided. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice carrying through the packed room. "For years, we have been told what art is. We have been shown tranquil landscapes and flattering portraits. Tonight, we are showing you a truth. An artist who paints not what she is told to see, but what she feels in her bones." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "I present to you the work of Kujau Mat." She turned and gestured towards the shadows where Lin was hiding. This was her cue. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. This was the moment of unmasking. She took a step forward. Into the light. A collective gasp went through the room. They had been expecting a man, a grizzled, angry revolutionary. They saw a young, slender woman, her expression a mixture of terror and fierce defiance. And then, the main door to the gallery swung open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Two figures stood silhouetted against the night. The first was Charles Revel, his bland face contorted with shock and betrayal. The second, standing behind him, was a figure of pure, cold fury. Monsieur Auguste Dubois. A hush fell over the crowd. The air crackled with tension. Dubois's eyes, chips of ice, swept over the room, over the paintings, and finally, they landed on Lin. The look he gave her was not one of fatherly anger. It was one of utter contempt, the look a man gives to a thing he intends to eradicate. He strode into the center of the room, his presence sucking all the air out of it. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His power was in his stillness, in the absolute authority he radiated. "This charade is over," he said, his voice quiet and deadly. He turned to the crowd. "My daughter has been unwell. She has fallen under the influence of radicals and degenerates." He waved a dismissive hand at the paintings. "This is the product of a fevered mind. It means nothing." He then turned to Lin. His voice dropped lower, for her alone, but in the dead silence, everyone heard it. "You will come home with me now, Isabelle. We will forget this ever happened. You will marry Charles next week as planned. This is your last chance to save yourself from utter ruin." This was it. The final battle. The entire room was watching, waiting. She could see the escape route he offered. A life of silent, comfortable subservience. She looked at Charles, who was wringing his hands, a picture of pathetic indecision. She looked at the faces in the crowd, some scornful, some pitying, a few, like bows, filled with a fierce, unwavering belief. And then she looked at her art. At the raw, screaming, truthful pieces of her soul hanging on the walls. They were not the product of a fever. They were the cure. She took a deep breath and faced her father. She met his icy gaze without flinching. She walked over to the nearest painting, the lacquer-stained sky, and gently touched the name card beside it, the one that read Kujau Mat. She turned it over. On the back, she had written her name that morning. She held it up for the room to see. "My name," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the silent gallery, "is Isabelle Lin Dubois. And this is my work." Dubois stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had lost. In public. He turned, his back ramrod straight, and strode out of the gallery without another word. Charles, after a moment of panicked hesitation, scurried after him. The spell was broken. A buzz of excited, shocked conversation erupted through the room. Lin had faced the dragon and had not been burned. She had claimed her name, her art, and her soul. The aftermath of the confrontation was a chaotic blur. The departure of Monsieur Dubois, a titan of the colonial establishment, acted not as an end, but as a catalyst. The gallery, which had been tense, now hummed with a new, more dangerous energy. The French officials and their wives, scandalized and unnerved, made hasty departures, whispering about the sheer audacity, the impropriety of it all. But those who remained, the artists, the intellectuals, the students, a handful of curious European journalists, surged forward, their curiosity now ignited into genuine excitement. They crowded around Lynn, not with pity, but with a barrage of questions. They saw her not as a disgraced daughter, but as a symbol of a new, defiant art form. Your use of color, it is expressionistic. But distinctly non-European. Is your work a political statement on the colonial condition? Mademoiselle, how does your dual heritage inform your aesthetic? Lynn, exhausted and overwhelmed, could only offer simple, honest answers. I paint what I feel. I paint what I see. Her quiet authenticity seemed to resonate more than any grand artistic manifesto. Bao remained by her side, a calm anchor in the storm, occasionally stepping in to translate a nuance or deflect a question that was too intrusive. Madame Elodie, meanwhile, was transformed. The cynical mask had vanished, replaced by the shrewd, triumphant gleam of a master strategist. She moved through the remaining crowd, a glass of champagne in hand, speaking in low, confidential tones, fanning the flames. Lynn overheard a snippet of conversation with a well-known art critic. Of course it's political, darling. All honest art is. She is the future. By the end of the night, something miraculous had happened. 3 paintings had sold. Not to established collectors, but to a young French academic who saw a connection to the Surrealists, a wealthy Vietnamese merchant who was a quiet nationalist sympathizer, and a visiting American journalist who called it the most exciting thing she'd seen in Asia. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more money than Lynn had ever held in her life. It was proof. It was validation. It was a beginning. As the last guests departed, leaving a trail of cigarette smoke and the scent of spilled wine, the 3 of them stood alone in the gallery. Lynn, Bao, and Elodie. An unlikely trinity of rebellion. The silence that descended was heavy, not with tension, but with the weight of what had just transpired. Well, Elodie said, finally breaking the silence as she began to collect empty glasses. That was certainly more dramatic than my usual Tuesday evening. She looked at Lynn, a genuine, rare smile touching her lips. I believe my wager has paid off. You, my dear, are now officially a problem. And in the art world, there is no higher compliment. Lynn felt a laugh bubble up, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. But it was quickly followed by the sobering reality of her situation. I have a new name, she said quietly. But I have no home. Nonsense, Elodie said, waving her hand dismissively. Your home is here. She gestured around the gallery, at the canvases that lined the walls. As for a place to sleep, the proceeds from tonight will afford you a slightly better attic than the one you are used to. And I suspect you will not be alone in finding it. She gave a pointed, knowing look towards Bao. Bao's cheeks flushed slightly, but he met Lynn's gaze with a steady warmth. My room is small, he said. But my friends are many. We will find you a place. You are one of us now. One of us, the words resonated deep in Lynn's soul. She had lost a father, a house, a name that was a lie. But tonight, standing in a room filled with her own truth, flanked by a cynical gambler and a fervent poet, she had found something infinitely more valuable. She had found a tribe. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for 22 years had finally, blessedly, begun to recede. The days following the exhibition were a strange mix of triumph and terror. News of the dramatic confrontation at Gallery Elodie spread through Hanoi like wildfire. The official French newspapers were silent on the matter. A Du Bois was not to be publicly embarrassed, but the whispers were everywhere. In the cafes, in the market, in the university halls, people spoke of the governor's daughter who had chosen art over privilege. To the colonial establishment, she was a disgrace. To the burgeoning nationalist movement and the city's artistic underground, she became an instant hero. This newfound fame was a double-edged sword. It brought a steady stream of curious visitors to the gallery, but it also brought unwanted attention. Lynn felt the weight of her father's unseen influence. Landlords of respectable apartments suddenly had no vacancies when she inquired. Merchants who had been friendly now averted their eyes. The system was quietly, efficiently closing its doors to her. It was Bao and his network who provided the safety net. They found her a room. It was not in a respectable building, but on the top floor of a tenement that housed families of laborers, noodle vendors, and cyclo drivers. The room was small, the walls were thin, and the stairway was perpetually slick with grime, but it was hers. From its one large window, she had a panoramic view of the chaotic, beautiful mess of the old quarter rooftops, a landscape of endless possibility. The money from the first sales, which had seemed like a fortune, dwindled quickly. It paid for the room's deposit, for new clothes, for food, and for the one luxury she allowed herself, high-quality brushes and pigments. Elodie continued to supply her with canvases, her investment now secured. An artist must create, she'd said. Leave the selling to me. Lynn's life was pared down to its essentials, art and survival. She established a new routine. She would wake at dawn, with the first calls of the street vendors, and paint for hours, the morning light flooding her small room. The work she produced now was different. The raw anger and pain were still there, but they were tempered by a newfound complexity, a sense of hope, and a deep connection to the city she now truly inhabited. She painted the old woman who lived downstairs, her face a roadmap of wrinkles and sorrows. She painted the children playing in the alley below, their laughter a defiant music. Her art was becoming less of a personal scream and more of a collective song. In the afternoons, she would explore the city with Bao. He showed her its hidden corners, its secret histories. They were no longer just artist and admirer, they were partners. He would read her his latest poems, full of fierce love for his country and rage at its oppression, and she would show him her sketches, her visual translations of the city's soul. They were mapping a new kind of territory together, one made of words and images, a vision of a Vietnam that could be. The threat of her father lingered. She knew he would not let her succeed. She heard rumors, that he was pressuring Elodie's suppliers, that he was having Bao followed. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, a reminder that her freedom was fragile. But the fear no longer paralyzed her. It fueled her. It sharpened the lines in her work and deepened the shadows. She was no longer the frightened girl in the attic. She was a woman who had faced down her dragon and chosen to live. Every canvas she completed was an act of defiance, a declaration that she would not be erased. The city was a fickle beast. Lynn's initial notoriety began to fade, replaced by the next scandal. The next political rumor. The stream of visitors to the gallery slowed to a trickle. Elodie managed to sell another piece here and there, enough for Lynn to subsist on rice and vegetables, but the grand victory of that first night felt a long way off. The reality of her choice settled in. Freedom was not a single, dramatic act, but a daily, grinding struggle. The pressure from her father's world was constant and insidious. A planned feature on Lynn in a progressive French-language journal was mysteriously cancelled at the last minute. An invitation to a group show with other emerging artists was rescinded without explanation. The invisible walls were closing in, trying to isolate her, to starve her art of oxygen. During this time, her reliance on Bao and Elodie became absolute. Elodie was her shield in the art world. Her cynical pragmatism a necessary armor against disappointment. She taught Lynn about business, about pricing, about dealing with the handful of brave or foolhardy collectors who still sought her out. Never let them see your desperation, Elodie advised. Art is a confidence game, my dear. Bao, on the other hand, was her connection to the city's heart. When Lynn felt her spirit flagging, he would draw her back into his world. He took her to a traditional water puppet show, explaining the ancient folklore with a scholar's passion. He introduced her to a master lacquer artisan, a quiet old man whose workshop was a temple of patience and precision. Lynn watched, fascinated, as he painstakingly applied layer after layer of the viscous sap, creating a depth and luminosity she had never imagined. The experience planted a seed in her mind. She began to experiment, incorporating the traditional techniques into her modern, rebellious style, creating a hybrid art that was uniquely her own. Their personal bond deepened into a quiet, unspoken love. In a life of such uncertainty, their relationship was a point of stillness. There were no grand declarations, only small moments of profound connection, the way he would bring her a warm banh mi when she had forgotten to eat. The way she would leave a new sketch on his table for him to find, the shared silence as they watched the sunset from her rooftop, the city spread out below them like a promise. One evening, the threat they all lived with materialized. Bao came to her room late, his face grim, a fresh bruise darkening his cheekbone. "What happened?" Lin cried, rushing to his side. "A warning," he said, his voice low and tight with anger. "Some of Du Bois's men. They cornered me near the university. They suggested I should spend less time with the disgraced daughter of a powerful man." Lin's blood ran cold. This was different. This was not about canceling articles or rescinding invitations. This was physical violence. Her father was escalating his war. "They are trying to isolate you," Bao said, echoing her own fears. "They want you to be alone. To give up." Lin gently touched the bruise on his face, her fingers trembling. "This is my fault. You are in danger because of me." "No," Bao said fiercely, taking her hand. "I am in danger because I believe in a free Vietnam. You are in danger because you believe in a free art. It is the same fight, Lin. We are fighting it together." He looked at her, his eyes blazing. "And we will not lose." But looking at his bruised face, Lin felt a new, terrifying fear. It was one thing to risk her own future. It was another thing entirely to see the people she loved get hurt. Her father was not just trying to erase her art, he was willing to harm anyone who stood beside her. The stakes had been raised, and she knew a final confrontation was inevitable. She had to find a way to fight back, not just for herself, but for them. The attack on Bao was a turning point. The quiet struggle for survival was no longer enough. Lin realized that to be truly free, she couldn't just create in defiance of her father, she had to defeat the shadow he cast over her life and the lives of her friends. But how could she fight a man with so much power? She had no money, no political influence. Her only weapon was her art. The idea that had been seeded by the old lacquer master began to bloom. She would not just incorporate lacquer into her work, she would make it her central medium. It was a deeply symbolic choice. Lacquer was ancient, traditional, quintessentially Vietnamese. By taking this revered, classical art form and using it to express her modern, savage vision, she was making a powerful statement. She was claiming her entire heritage, both the ancient and the new, the beautiful and the broken, and forging it into something that could not be ignored. She approached Elodie with her new plan. "I want to create a new collection," she said, her voice filled with a new, hard-edged determination. "Entirely in lacquer on wood. It will be my answer to him. To all of them." Elodie, seeing the fire in her eyes, agreed immediately. "It will be expensive. The materials are precious. The process is slow." "It has to be this," Lin insisted. Elodie secured a commission from the wealthy Vietnamese merchant who had bought one of Lin's first paintings. It was enough to fund the project. For the next 6 months, Lin disappeared into her work with an almost monastic devotion. Working with lacquer was a demanding, unforgiving process. It was slow, painstaking, and even dangerous. The raw lacquer sap was poisonous to the touch. She learned through trial and error, her hands often swollen and raw from the exposure. Bao would tend to her hands at night, wrapping them in herbal poultices, his face a mixture of worry and pride. She poured all the pain, rage, and hope of the past year into these new pieces. She created a portrait of her father, his face a cold, perfect mask, but behind him, the deep, black lacquer was cracked, revealing a chaotic, crimson underlayer. She created a portrait of Bao, his bruised cheek rendered in deep purples, but his eyes shining with an inlay of mother-of-pearl. Her masterpiece was a large, multi-panel piece depicting the two faces of Hanoi. On one side, the sterile, geometric order of the French Quarter, rendered in polished, flawless black. On the other, the vibrant, chaotic life of the Old Quarter, a riot of color and texture, gleaming with life. The two sides were forever separate, yet part of the same whole. As the collection neared completion, Elodie and Bao prepared for their final gambit. They would stage a second solo exhibition. This time, it would not be a secret. It would be a public challenge. They sent out formal invitations. They secured a review from the American journalist who had been an early supporter. They were deliberately, publicly, poking the beast. They all knew the risk. Du Bois could not afford to let this succeed. He would do something to stop it. The air in the weeks leading up to the opening was thick with unspoken dread. Bao's friends began acting as informal bodyguards, escorting Lin to and from the gallery. The night before the opening, Lin stood in the gallery, the finished lacquer pieces gleaming under the lights. They were magnificent. They were the culmination of everything she had endured. They were her voice, made solid and permanent. Elodie came and stood beside her. "He will not let this happen quietly," she said. "Are you prepared?" Lin looked at her reflection in the polished surface of her father's portrait. She saw a woman she barely recognized. Her face was thinner, her eyes older, but they held a strength that had been forged in fire. "He is the one who should be afraid," Lin said. "He tried to burn my art. Instead, I have carved it into stone." The opening night arrived, heavy with anticipation. The gallery was more crowded than ever before. A testament to the legend of Kujiao Mat and the simmering scandal that surrounded her. This time, the mood was different. It wasn't just artistic curiosity, it was the feeling of being present at a historic moment, a public duel between a father's power and a daughter's will. Security, organized by Bao's student network, was discreet but visible. The American journalist was there, front and center. Her notebook open. The atmosphere was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Lin stood in the center of the room, beside her multi-panel masterpiece. She did not hide. She was dressed simply, her hands, still slightly swollen from the lacquer work, clasped in front of her. She met the eyes of every guest, a quiet queen in her own court. An hour into the event, the spark came. Not in the form of Monsieur Du Bois, but in the form of two uniformed French policemen, accompanied by a grim-faced official from the Colonial Arts Commission. They pushed their way through the crowd, their presence an immediate violation. The official unrolled a scroll and, in a loud, officious voice, read a prepared statement. "By order of the Office of the Governor-General, this exhibition is hereby deemed a threat to public order and a display of subversive materials. The gallery is to be closed immediately, and the works confiscated for review." The crowd erupted in protest. Elodie stepped forward, her face pale with fury. "On what grounds? This is a private gallery. You have no authority here." "Our authority comes from the highest level, madam," the official said with a smug smile. "The works are an insult to the administration and an incitement to rebellion." This was her father's move. It was more clever and more brutal than a personal confrontation. He was using the full, impersonal weight of the colonial state to crush her. He wasn't just disowning her, he was branding her an enemy of the state. The police began to move towards the paintings. Lin felt a moment of pure, cold despair. He had won. He could take her art, lock it away, destroy it. But then, something shifted. Bao stepped forward, positioning himself in front of Lin's masterpiece. Then another student joined him. And another. Within seconds, a human chain of young Vietnamese men and women had formed, linking arms, standing between the police and the art. They were unarmed, their faces a mixture of fear and absolute resolve. They did not shout. They simply stood, a silent, immovable wall. The police hesitated, taken aback. The American journalist was scribbling furiously. Her photographer's flashbulb popping, capturing the standoff. This was no longer an internal family dispute. It was a clear image of colonial power attempting to silence Vietnamese expression, and the youth rising to defend it. The official, his face turning red, ordered the police to move forward. As the first policeman laid a hand on a student's shoulder, Bao's voice rang out, clear and strong. "The whole world is watching," he shouted, gesturing towards the journalist. The official froze. He understood immediately. To use force now, to arrest these students in front of a foreign journalist, would create an international incident. It would turn this small gallery affair into a major political embarrassment for his superiors, for Auguste Dubois himself. He was trapped. Lin watched, her heart pounding. She was not fighting alone. The students, her community, were on the front lines, risking their own safety for her art, for what it represented. Her personal struggle had become their struggle. Defeated, the official snarled an order. The policeman reluctantly fell back. He gave Lin a look of pure venom. "This is not over," he spat, before turning and storming out of the gallery, his men trailing behind him. A huge, ragged cheer erupted from the crowd. They had won. The small, fragile community had faced down the power of the state and held their ground. Lin looked at Bao, at the faces of the students who had protected her work. Tears streamed down her face, not of sadness, but of an overwhelming, fierce, and profound gratitude. Her art had found its true guardians. The failed confiscation was a catastrophic miscalculation for Auguste Dubois. The American journalist's story, complete with a powerful photograph of the student human chain, ran in several international papers. It portrayed the colonial administration as a clumsy, oppressive regime and Lin as a courageous artistic freedom fighter. The scandal was immense. Dubois, the man obsessed with order and reputation, had become an international symbol of tyranny. His power, which had seemed absolute, was crippled by public opinion. Within a month, he was quietly recalled to a minor, desk-bound post in Paris, his career in Indochina over. He disappeared from Hanoi without a word to his daughter. Lin never saw him again. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic apology. He simply vanished from her life, his power dissolving like a phantom. The victory felt strange, hollow. There was no elation, only a quiet, sad sense of closure. The war was over, not with a bang, but with a weary sigh. With her father's shadow lifted, the world opened up to Lin. The exhibition was a phenomenal success. Collectors, both foreign and Vietnamese, now saw her work not just as art, but as an investment in a piece of history. She sold nearly every piece, securing her financial independence and the future of Gallery Elodie. But success brought its own challenges. She was inundated with offers, with commissions, with demands on her time. She was celebrated, feted, and turned into a symbol she didn't always recognize. The quiet, focused life of the artist was threatened by the noisy business of being a famous artist. It was Bao who kept her grounded. Their love, forged in struggle, now had to learn to navigate peace. His own path was becoming more dangerous. As a recognized leader in the student movement, he was under constant surveillance. Their moments together were precious, islands of calm in a turbulent sea. One evening, months after her father's departure, they stood on the rooftop of her new, larger studio, a space she had bought in the heart of the old quarter. The city lights twinkled below them. "Are you happy, Lin?" he asked softly. She thought for a moment. "Happy is not the right word," she said. "I have freedom. I have my work. I have you. But the fight isn't over. It has just changed." She looked out at the city. "My father is gone, but the world that made him is still here." Her art began to change again. It moved beyond her personal story. She started a new series, not about her own pain, but about the lives of the people her success had been built upon, the cyclo drivers, the women in the market, the students with fire in their eyes. Her work became a chronicle of her city's soul, its resilience, its beauty, its quiet defiance. The final scene of the story finds her a year later. She is alone in her studio, the afternoon light streaming in. The room is filled with new canvases, works in progress. There is a letter on her table from a gallery in Paris, inviting her for a major European exhibition. It is the kind of success she could never have dreamed of. But she is not looking at the letter. She is standing before a large, blank canvas. The world was calling to her, but her true north was still here, in the scent of paint and turpentine, in the challenge of an empty space. Her journey had not been about escaping to a new world, but about finally, fully inhabiting her own. She picked up a brush, dipped it in a deep, vibrant crimson, the color of lacquer, of blood, of life, and looked at the blank canvas. Her past was behind her, her future was uncertain, but this moment was hers. It was a moment of profound peace, of infinite possibility. She was not a daughter, not a symbol, not a scandal. She was an artist. And she was ready to begin. She raised the brush and made the first, bold stroke.